normalcy is returning.
Just in dealing with the people that I've come in contact with, I notice a lot of people whose moods are fluctuating somewhat wildly. I mean, at what point do you look at someone and say, okay, they're just obviously under a lot of stress, and when do you cross the line and say someone may need professional help?
That's an interesting question, because I think right now everyone needs professional help. Everyone that was involved, everyone who's had family involved, everyone who's seen the carnage on TV, people jumping from burning buildings. I think all of those people need to be debriefed, if you will, in some way. Usually those things will get better as we get further away from the traumatic event. The people that will need intense treatment are the people that don't get better after several weeks, after several months. And there will be a small percentage of people that will have symptoms that increase. With the last World Trade Center bombing back in the mid-90s, we had people complaining of symptoms related to the event a year after the event was over.
Right after the initial planes went into the World Trade Center, they are missing and presumed to be dead tonight. We do not know how many people are still trapped in the rubble of those two 110-story buildings that came down, nor do we know the exact death toll for that matter.
They're both down now. It's just a huge cloud of smoke.
People who have been right down next to the base of what was the trade towers say there's virtually nothing left, maybe a few flights of stairs, a few stories of one of the buildings, but that when they came down there was so much melting and so much demolishing of any kind of structure that they cannot imagine much being left or much hope of finding anybody alive. But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes, including correspondent Don Daler, telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers. They're pouring water onto it, trying to get the trade towers themselves cooled down enough to move into the very center of it.
Ankle deep in debris and despair, rescue workers waited. Some had relatives of their own inside. One police officer told me her sister worked here on the 40th floor, due in at 9 a.m. She was always early, she said. Always.
A ruin. Countless souls crushed beneath. Some of them, we're told, were on the phone, saying farewell to their families as the building burned. Some of them, the firefighters, the police. There, not by order, but by spirit.
Set up in this huge sports complex, as close as you can reasonably get to the World Trade Center. It's very close indeed on the West Side Highway. That skeleton of the front facade of the lower part of one of the trade centers, and we've seen this many times, this horrendous.
You know, the sophistication of the National Security Agency and their ability to intercept communications worldwide, and they zero in, they target bin Laden's operation routinely. They picked up intercepts with some members of his organization apparently referring to these targets having been hit. They've been successful in the past building cases against bin Laden by picking up this kind of information, these kinds of communications. They also believe that at least one person on one of the 4 doomed flights may have been a member of his organization. So as disastrous as this is, they will have leads from people checking into airports.
Are you picking up anything about sending emissaries around the world in an effort to build what has been described as an extraordinary coalition of people to try to build an alliance against the idea of terrorism?
And nothing at this time, though.
Yeah. You said the rubble. If you give me some idea of the rubble, how big it is, how much there is. I mean, the thought of 100...
Blocks. It's a 40-story building and both World Trade Centers and all the little buildings that were surrounding. It's just blocks of rubble. There's no way to describe it unless you're actually up there looking at it.
Responses that we've seen in the past. This is not going to be a single salvo of cruise missiles, but rather the beginning of an ongoing campaign. On Normandy beaches here, there's not going to be eventually anybody that steps out on the decks of a battleship and signs a surrender.
But is there going to be a scene like the one we're looking at now, this utter destruction of what amounts to a World War III scene in someone else's country?
Probably not. Nor do I think that
much of a hand to lend because most of the people were buried.
And does that appear to continue to be the situation tonight?
Yeah, I think yesterday as the casualties started coming into the hospital, there was pretty much a steady flow at the early part of the day, around noon, 1, 2, 3 o'clock, and then it started to tail off.
It was amazing to see, and while you think you should turn away and escape, I think everybody was just frozen. And watching. There was a lot of crying. I think that a lot of people were extremely disturbed, but very few people left the scene. The other thing that was quite disturbing, I think no one, including myself, questioned the integrity and the strength of both the buildings that collapsed.
Which building is that? They said, you know, I don't even think we know which one is which. But you can see the intensity of the wreckage here and the smoke still rising.
And this is not to denigrate anybody involved with airport security, but let's face it, it was pretty much a kiss-off by the airlines and everybody else. Now, there have been various calls for federal agencies to take over the security of U.S. airports. After all, these airports belong to the people of the United States, not to the airlines. Whether that will go anywhere, I don't know. We did have sky marshals for a while in the late 70s on into the 1980s. They were done away with. My assumption is, Anthony Mason helped me, that one reason we did away with them was a matter of budget, of money.
Well, I don't recall the reason myself, Dan, but I mean, anybody who's been through an airport knows the security isn't as stringent.
Working in teams of 2, rescuers have been clambering through the wreckage. 6,000 tons of rubble have been removed, every ounce to be sifted by the FBI for criminal evidence. Dogs are used to search for human signs.
Finally, whoever planned this attack knew a decisive detail about the physics of tall buildings.
The energy required to bring it down is already stored in the structure in the form of potential energy. All the energy used to raise those construction materials into place in the late 60s and early 70s when they built the structure is there if you could just find a way to release it and let gravity take over.
Marc Loiseau is president of a company called Controlled Demolition. Release a building's stored energy, he says, its collapse becomes a matter not of terrorism, but the laws of physics.
You don't have to go to the top floor. You can go almost anywhere in the structure. You don't have to go to the top floor. You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, converting it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Yet the impact of the planes alone did not cause that failure. In fact, tall building designers try to anticipate air accidents.
When this structure was designed, it was designed, to the best of my understanding, to take the impact of what was then the state-of-the-art airplane being used in our country, the Boeing 707. And if you noticed that when the planes impacted Towers 1 and Tower 2, the structure stood.
As time progressed, what was clear to anyone in New York City or to the millions of people watching the horror unfold on television, fire was engulfing the building. The worst enemy of a steel-reinforced structure is heat, extreme heat. Physics professor and explosives expert Van Romero.
At what point was there no chance of survival, do you think?
Once the fire starts inside the building, once the building structure itself, materials inside that building start to burn, it can race through the building faster than you can run.
Engineers suspect the temperatures inside the crash areas could have quickly reached well over 1,000 degrees, perhaps approaching 2,000 degrees, beyond the melting point of any steel. The heat would have obliterated the insulation around the structure, the fire suppression system. Once this happened, nothing could save the Twin Towers.
When the plane hits the building, the kinetic energy, if you will, or the momentum of the plane hitting the building is actually pretty small compared to the fuel. When the fuel explodes from the jet fuel that's on the airplane, that can really have much more devastating effect on the building itself.
When the World Trade Center was built in the 1960s, its soaring steel columns made it like nothing constructed before. Huge prefabricated sections were hoisted into position as the towers grew higher at an impressive pace.
In retrospect, would it have been different had there been more supporting beams in a greater area around this building?
Well, frankly, it's hard to imagine a building having more steel than this structure.
Beginning, the towers seemed incredibly stable, each apparently absorbing the impact of a Boeing 767 traveling at close to 500 miles an hour. The explosion of jet fuel that followed was the equivalent of a massive bomb, says physics professor Stephen Block.